Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Journeyman Podcast. We are kicking off episode 34 with a deep dive into a topic that's been getting a lot of buzz: dopamine. If you're new here, be sure to hit that like and subscribe button so you don't miss out on future deep dives. Today, we're going to be drawing from this super interesting interview with Dr. Anna Lembke. She's a professor of psychiatry at Stanford, heads up the Stanford Addiction Clinic, and wrote Dopamine Nation, so she knows what she's talking about. She did an interview on YouTube with Diary of a CEO, and we'll have the link to that video in the show notes, so go check it out. You should definitely check out their channel, too. They've got some great content. But for now, let's get right into some of Dr. Lemke's most insightful points about dopamine.
You know, what's so interesting is that a lot of people just think of dopamine as like the pleasure chemical, right? But Dr. Lemke really highlights how it's all about survival.
Okay, so it's not just about us feeling good, it's about what kept us alive back in the day.
Right. Think about our ancestors. They needed dopamine to motivate them to hunt, gather food, find shelter, all the stuff they needed to survive. Dr. Lemke talked about this really cool rat study where they engineered rats without dopamine. And these rats, they would only eat if the food was right there in their mouths. If they had to move even a little bit to get it, they'd just starve.
Hold on, so they had the ability to eat, but zero motivation to actually go and get the food.
Exactly. And that's a key point that Dr. Lemke makes. Dopamine isn't just about us feeling pleasure. It's the thing that drives us to chase the things that give us pleasure or that we need to survive.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So how does all that old wiring work in today's world? I mean, we're not out hunting for our dinner anymore.
Right, and that's where things get really interesting. Our brains haven't quite caught up to all the easy pleasure we've got these days. Junk food, social media, streaming services, you name it. All of these things are constantly triggering dopamine release, and that's what Dr. Lemke argues is making us all more vulnerable to addiction.
So it's like our brains are stuck in that survival mode, but instead of going after scarce resources, we're chasing likes and binge-watching shows.
That's a great way to put it. And this is where the idea of the brain's pleasure-pain balance comes into play. Think of it like a seesaw, trying to stay level. When we get a surge of dopamine from something pleasurable, our brain tries to compensate by ramping up pain or discomfort.
Oh, so that explains the hangover after a night out, or the intense cravings when you're trying to kick a sugar habit.
Exactly. Our brain is always trying to maintain that balance. It's called homeostasis. And because there's so much stuff triggering dopamine all the time today, our brains are just constantly trying to rebalance.
And that makes it so much harder to resist all those temptations.
Precisely. In fact, even Dr. Lemke had an interesting addiction romance novels.
Really? Romance novels?
Yeah.
That doesn't sound as hardcore as some other addictions.
I know, right? It kind of makes you question your assumptions about what addiction really is. For Dr. Lemke, it got to the point where she was neglecting her responsibilities, staying up late to read, even hiding it from her family.
So it was actually causing problems in her life, even though it wasn't a substance or anything obviously harmful.
Exactly. And she realized that it was hijacking her dopamine system, just like any other addiction. And this ties into something else she mentioned, the different pathways for dopamine in the brain.
Okay, tell me more about those.
So you've got the mesolimbic pathway. It's associated with reward and pleasure, and it's a big player in addiction. But then you've also got the mesocortical pathway, which is more linked to motivation and decision-making.
So are different pathways involved depending on the type of reward or activity?
Exactly. And the issue is our modern world is just constantly stimulating all these pathways, making us want more and more.
It's like being on a dopamine treadmill, always chasing that next hit. So what can we do about it? How do we get off this treadmill?
Dr. Lemke has some really practical advice for that, which I think we should dive into next time. But first, I think it's really important to just grasp how powerful these dopamine triggers are, even in things that seem totally harmless. She mentioned this other crazy case study about a patient who was addicted to, wait for it, water.
Water, like drinking too much water.
Yep. This patient was drinking excessive amounts of water to make themselves delirious. It just shows how our brains can get hooked on almost anything that messes with that dopamine release, even something as basic as water.
Wow, that's intense. It really puts things in perspective. But now I'm super curious to hear what Dr. Lemke says we can actually do about all this.
She's got some great tips, and I think they'll be especially helpful for anyone listening who thinks they might be struggling with an addiction or even just a bad habit they can't seem to break.
Well, I'm definitely ready to hear them. Let's dive into that in the next part of our deep dive. But first, a quick reminder to hit that like and subscribe button if you're digging this episode. We'll be right back after a short break.
So, you were asking about Dr. Lemke's advice for, managing those dopamine triggers. and maybe even like breaking free from addictive stuff.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Especially after that water addiction thing, it's clear this is something we all need to be aware of.
Absolutely. And her approach is really about taking back control of how we relate to dopamine, not trying to like get rid of it altogether. One of her main suggestions is this thing she calls dopamine fasting.
Dopamine fasting.
Mm.
So that's like abstaining from anything that triggers dopamine. That sounds pretty hardcore.
It can sound kind of intimidating, but it's not as extreme as it sounds. It's about picking one specific substance or behavior that's been a problem and taking a 30-day break from it.
Okay, so it's targeted, not like a total dopamine detox,
Yeah.
but still, whole month. What's the logic behind that time frame?
Dr. Lemke says that giving your brain that long of a break lets those reward pathways reset. It helps you become more aware of how that thing is affecting you, like both physically and mentally.
So it's kind of like hitting the pause button to see things more clearly.
Exactly. And it's not about, just powering through it with willpower. She really stresses self-binding, which basically means putting up barriers to make it harder to do the addictive thing.
Okay, I like that. Give me some examples of self-binding.
Let's say you're trying to cut back on social media. You could delete those apps from your phone, use website blockers, or even have a friend change your passwords for a bit.
So you're basically getting rid of the temptation or making it so annoying that you're less likely to cave?
Right. It's about being proactive and setting yourself up to succeed instead of just relying on willpower, which can be, pretty unreliable. Dr. Lemke actually used self-binding when she was trying to quit romance novels.
How did that go for her?
She decided to give them up for 30 days. And during that time, she felt so much better sleep, better focus, just better overall. She was able to reconnect with other activities and interests she had been neglecting.
That's really great to hear. It shows that these strategies can actually work. But what about after those 30 days? Do those cravings just come right back?
Yeah, that's a totally valid concern. And Dr. Lemke is very clear that dopamine fasting isn't a one-time fix. It's about building awareness and then making deliberate choices about how you want to bring that thing back into your life, if at all.
So it's not about deprivation. It's about taking back control and finding a better balance.
That's the core of it. And this leads into something really interesting that Dr. Lemke said about happiness itself. She suggested that maybe true happiness isn't about constantly chasing pleasure.
Ooh, that's a really interesting idea. Tell me more.
She was saying that this constant search for dopamine hits might actually be getting in the way of real joy and contentment.
Because we're always looking for that next fix, that next hit of pleasure.
Right. And she said that maybe the way to true happiness is learning to be okay with discomfort. She even said that activities that are initially uncomfortable, like exercise or cold exposure, can actually lead to a longer-lasting release of dopamine.
So pushing ourselves out of our comfort zone can be good for our dopamine system in the long run.
It seems counterintuitive, but think about it. When you exercise, you release endorphins, which are natural mood boosters. And with cold exposure, there's that initial shock, but then your body adapts and releases dopamine as a reward.
It's like our brains reward us for overcoming challenges.
Exactly. And those rewards, they feel so much more earned and fulfilling than those quick hits we get from social media or junk food.
This is making me completely rethink how I approach pleasure and happiness. I've always avoided discomfort, but maybe embracing it is the key.
It's definitely a different way of thinking, but Dr. Lemke's insights suggest it might be worth trying. And this connects to another fascinating thing. She brought up the sociological perspective on addiction.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. What does sociology have to do with addiction?
Well, she talked about the work of Kai Erikson. He studied deviance in Puritan societies. And he noticed that every group tends to have those deviant individuals, the ones who are on the fringe or outside the norm.
So like the black sheep of the family or the rebel in a friend group.
Exactly. And Erickson's research suggested that when one person stops filling that role, someone else usually steps in to take their place.
So it's like addiction can be a role someone plays within a family or social circle.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. And it shows how addiction isn't just a personal thing. It can be shaped by the dynamics and expectations of the people around us.
That's a really interesting point. It makes you realize how complex addiction really is. It's not just about willpower or bad choices.
Right. And this leads to something else. Dr. Lemke mentioned how addiction can affect people differently at different points in their lives.
Okay, so how does age factor into this?
Well, she said that the teenage brain is especially vulnerable to addiction. It's still developing. Those neural pathways involved in reward and decision-making are still being formed, so exposure to addictive stuff early on can have a bigger impact.
So teenagers are more likely to get hooked because their brains are still wiring up.
That's part of it. But she also said that the young brain is super plastic, meaning it can change and adapt. So while teenagers might be more likely to get addicted, they're also better at recovering and rewiring their brains with the right help.
That's good to hear. But what about older people? How does addiction look different later in life?
Dr. Lemke said that sometimes people who've had their addiction under control for years can relapse later in life. Things like retirement, loss of loved ones, or health problems can be triggers.
So it's not just the biological stuff in the brain, it's also the social and emotional challenges that come with aging.
Absolutely. It shows how important it is to have support and stay aware throughout our lives because addiction can sneak up on us in ways we don't expect.
This is making me realize how much I don't know about addiction. It's so much deeper than just personal failure or weak willpower.
Yeah, and Dr. Lemke's insights really challenged the stigma and shame around addiction. She shared some really sad stories about patients who died from addiction. It was a reminder of how serious this is and the terrible consequences it can have.
It's a reminder that addiction is a huge public health problem and deserves attention, compassion, and real treatment options.
And it can affect anyone, no matter their background, age, or social status.
Speaking of which, Dr. Lembke talked about her own experience with romance novels.
Right, it's a perfect example of how addiction isn't always about drugs or alcohol. It can be anything that hijacks our reward system and makes us act compulsively. And in our modern world, with all its distractions and temptations, those triggers are everywhere.
It's true. We're always being bombarded with things that release dopamine. From the constant information on our phones to the endless junk food and entertainment, it makes it so hard to find balance and resist those urges.
It's a fight we're all in, to some degree, and it takes awareness, self-reflection, and real effort to stay on track.
This is making me think about my own relationship with technology. I know I spend way too much time on my phone, but I always tell myself it's no big deal.
Dr. Lembke actually talked about that specifically. She said technology can be both good and bad. It can connect us and isolate us, empower us, and trap us.
It's like a double-edged sword that we have to learn to use carefully.
Exactly. And she's worried that as technology becomes more and more integrated into our lives, we might lose touch with what makes us human and the value of real-world connections.
That's a scary thought, but I can definitely see how it could happen. We're already so attached to our devices, and it's only going to get more intense as technology gets more advanced.
And that's why she stressed how important it is to be mindful of how we're using technology and to make choices that make our lives better, not worse.
This whole conversation has been so eye-opening. I feel like I'm seeing dopamine in a completely new way. It's not the enemy I thought it was, but it's definitely a powerful force that we need to understand and manage.
And Dr. Lemke's insights give us some great tools to do just that.
It's like we almost need like a new set of rules for how to deal with technology, like digital ethics or something.
I totally agree. We need to be talking about this now, before technology gets even more advanced and we end up somewhere we don't want to be.
Yeah, for sure. But it's not all bad news, right?
Yeah.
Technology can connect us in some really amazing ways.
Absolutely. And Dr. Lemke actually talked about that too. She said it's really important that we use that power for good, like use technology to build real connections, create communities, and support each other.
So it's not about like ditching technology completely. It's about using it in a way that's intentional and makes sense for us.
Exactly. It's about being aware of how technology is affecting us and making choices that line up with what we value and what's good for us.
This has really gotten me thinking about how I use dopamine and how it's influencing my choices. I'm definitely going to try to be more aware of those triggers and find better ways to feel good, long term.
I think that's a great takeaway. And remember, it's a process, not a one-time thing. There will be ups and downs. Those cravings will come back. There might be setbacks. But if we're aware and we put in the effort, we can all find a healthier, more balanced relationship with dopamine.
And maybe even find a deeper kind of happiness along the way.
I think so too.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive into the world of dopamine. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us.
It's been my pleasure. I love exploring these kinds of topics and hopefully helping people understand themselves a little better.
Well, you've definitely given us a lot to think about. And for our listeners, if you want to learn more about dopamine and addiction, definitely check out Dr. Lemke's books, Dopamine Nation and the Dopamine Nation Workbook. We'll link to those in the show notes, along with that full interview with Dr. Lembke from the Diary of a CEO YouTube channel.
Those are great resources if you're ready to go deeper into all this.
And if you enjoyed this deep dive, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the Journeyman Podcast for more insightful content. We'll be back soon with another episode. So until then, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep journeying.